Welcome to Slothful Slumber, the podcast where we transform the vast knowledge of the internet into a gentle lullaby for your mind. I'm your host, Luna Dreamwell, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to tranquility through the soothing cadence of Wikipedia articles. Each episode will delve into the most wonderfully mundane and sleep-inducing topics, helping you drift off into a realm of serene dreams. So find your comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the dull hum of information carry you into a restful slumber. Now, let's embark on tonight's voyage of tranquil learning as we explore a topic so peacefully uneventful, it just might whisk you away to the land of dreams. This Wikipedia article is titled Osiris. Osiris, from Egyptian Osiris, is the god of fertility, agriculture, the afterlife, the dead, resurrection, life, and vegetation in ancient Egyptian religion. He was classically depicted as a green-skinned deity with a pharaoh's beard, partially mummy-wrapped at the legs, wearing a distinctive ATF crown, and holding a symbolic crook and flail. He was one of the first to be associated with the mummy wrap. When his brother Set cut him up into pieces after killing him, Osiris's wife Isis found all the pieces and wrapped his body up, enabling him to return to life. Osiris was widely worshipped until the decline of ancient Egyptian religion during the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Osiris was at times considered the eldest son of the earth god Geb and the sky goddess Nut, as well as being brother and husband of Isis, and brother of Set, Nephthys, and Horus the elder, with Horus the younger being considered his posthumously begotten son. Through syncretism with Aya, he was also a god of the moon. Osiris was the judge and lord of the dead and the underworld, the lord of silence and Kenti Amentiu, meaning foremost of the Westerners. In the Old Kingdom, 2686 to 2181 BC, the pharaoh was considered a son of the sun god Ra, who, after his death, ascended to join Ra in the sky. After the spread of the Osiris cult, however, the kings of Egypt were associated with Osiris in death. As Osiris rose from the dead, they would unite with him and inherit eternal life through imitative magic. Through the hope of new life after death, Osiris began to be associated with the cycles in nature, in particular the sprouting of vegetation and the annual flooding of the Nile River, as well as the heliacal rising of Orion and Sirius at the start of the new year. He became the sovereign that granted all life, he who is permanently benign and youthful. The first evidence of the worship of Osiris is from the middle of the 5th dynasty of Egypt, 25th century BC, although it is likely that he was worshipped much earlier. The Kenti Amentiu epithet dates to at least the 1st dynasty, and was also used as a pharaonic title. Most information available on the Osiris myth is derived from allusions in the pyramid texts at the end of the 5th dynasty. Later New Kingdom source documents, such as the Shabaka stone and the Contendings of Horus and Seth, and much later in the narratives of Greek authors including Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus. Some Egyptologists believe the Osiris mythos may have originated in a former living ruler, possibly a shepherd who lived in pre-dynastic times, 5500 to 3100 BC, in the Nile Delta, whose beneficial rule led to him being revered as a god. The accoutrements of the shepherd, the crook, and the flail once insignia of the Delta god Angeti, with whom Osiris was associated, support this theory. Etymology of the name. Osiris is a Latin transliteration of the ancient Greek Osiris, which in turn is the Greek adaptation of the original name in the Egyptian language. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, the name appears as Ws-jar, which some Egyptologists instead choose to transliterate as S-jar. Since hieroglyphic writing lacks vowels, Egyptologists have vocalized the name in various ways, such as Asar, Ausar, Ausir, Wesir, Usir, or Usir. Several proposals have been made for the etymology and meaning of the original name. As Egyptologist Mark J. Smith notes, none are fully convincing. Most take Ws-jar as the accepted transliteration, following Adolf Erman. John Gwynne Griffiths, 1980. Bearing in mind Erman's emphasis on the fact that the name must begin with a WW, proposes a derivation from WSR with an original meaning of the Mighty One. Appearance. Osiris is represented in his most developed form of iconography wearing the Atef crown, which is similar to the white crown of Upper Egypt, but with the addition of 2 curling ostrich feathers at each side. He also carries the crook and flail. The crook is thought to represent Osiris as a shepherd god. The symbolism of the flail is more uncertain, with shepherd's whip, fly whisk, or association with the god Angeti of the 9th nome of Lower Egypt proposed. He was commonly depicted as a pharaoh with a complexion of either green, the color of rebirth, or black, alluding to the fertility of the Nile floodplain, in mummiform, wearing the trappings of mummification from chest downward. Early mythology. The pyramid texts describe early conceptions of an afterlife in terms of eternal traveling with the sun god amongst the stars. Amongst these mortuary texts, at the beginning of the 4th dynasty is found an offering the king gives and Anubis. By the end of the 5th dynasty, the formula in all tombs becomes an offering the king gives and Osiris, father of Horus. Osiris is the mythological father of the god Horus, whose conception is described in the Osiris myth, a central myth in ancient Egyptian belief. The myth describes Osiris as having been killed by his brother Set, who wanted Osiris's throne. His wife, Isis, finds the body of Osiris and hides it in the reeds, where it is found and dismembered by Set. Isis retrieves and joins the fragmented pieces of Osiris, then briefly revives him by use of magic. This spell gives her time to become pregnant by Osiris. Isis later gives birth to Horus. Since Horus was born after Osiris's resurrection, Horus became thought of as a representation of new beginnings and the vanquisher of the usurper Set. Ptah Seker, who resulted from the identification of the creator god Ptah with Seker, thus gradually became identified with Osiris, the two becoming Ptah Seker Osiris. As the sun was thought to spend the night in the underworld, and was subsequently reborn every morning, Ptah Seker Osiris was identified as king of the underworld, god of the afterlife, life, death, and regeneration. Osiris also has the aspect and form of Seker Osiris. Ram God. Osiris's soul, or rather his ba, was occasionally worshipped in its own right, almost as if it were a distinct god, especially in the delta city of Mendes. This aspect of Osiris was referred to as Banabjedet, which is grammatically feminine, also spelt Banabded or Banabjed, literally the ba of the Lord of the Jed, which roughly means the soul of the Lord of the pillar of continuity. The Djed, a type of pillar, was usually understood as the backbone of Osiris. The Nile supplying water, and Osiris, strongly connected to the vegetable regeneration, who died only to be resurrected, represented continuity and stability. As Benebjed, Osiris was given epithets such as Lord of the Sky and Life of the Sun God. Ra-Ba does not mean soul in the Western sense, and has to do with power, reputation, force of character, especially in the case of a god. Since the Ba was associated with power and also happened to be a word for Ram in Egyptian, Benebjed was depicted as a ram, or as ram-headed. A living sacred ram was kept at Mendes and worshipped as the incarnation of the god, and upon death, the rams were mummified and buried in a ram-specific necropolis. Benebjed was consequently said to be Horus's father, as Benebjed was an aspect of Osiris. Regarding the association of Osiris with the ram, the god's traditional crook and flail are the instruments of the shepherd, which has suggested to some scholars also an origin for Osiris in herding tribes of the Upper Nile. Mythology. Plutarch recounts one version of the Osiris myth in which Set, Osiris's brother, along with the Queen of Ethiopia, conspired with 72 accomplices to plot the assassination of Osiris. Set fooled Osiris into getting into a box, which Set then shut, sealed with lead, and threw into the Nile. Osiris's wife, Isis, searched for his remains until she finally found him embedded in a tamarisk tree trunk, which was holding up the roof of a palace in Byblos on the Phoenician coast. She managed to remove the coffin and retrieve her husband's body. In one version of the myth, Isis used a spell to briefly revive Osiris so he could impregnate her. After embalming and burying Osiris, Isis conceived and gave birth to their son, Horus. Thereafter, Osiris lived on as the god of the underworld. Because of his death and resurrection, Osiris was associated with the flooding and retreating of the Nile, and thus with the yearly growth and death of crops along the Nile Valley. Diodorus Siculus gives another version of the myth in which Osiris was described as an ancient king who taught the Egyptians the arts of civilization, including agriculture, then traveled the world with his sister Isis, the satyrs, and the 9 muses, before finally returning to Egypt. Osiris was then murdered by his evil brother Typhon, who was identified with Set. Typhon divided the body into 26 pieces, which he distributed amongst his fellow conspirators in order to implicate them in the murder. Isis and Hercules, Horus, avenged the death of Osiris and slew Typhon. Isis recovered all the parts of Osiris's body, except the phallus, and secretly buried them. She made replicas of them and distributed them to several locations, which then became centers of Osiris worship. Worship. Annual ceremonies were performed in honor of Osiris in various places across Egypt, evidences of which were discovered during underwater archaeological excavations of Frank Godillo and his team in the sunken city of Thonis Heraclean. These ceremonies were fertility rites which symbolized the resurrection of Osiris. Recent scholars emphasize the androgynous character of Osiris's fertility, clear from surviving material. For instance, Osiris's fertility has to come both from being castrated/cut into pieces and the reassembly by female Isis, whose embrace of her reassembled Osiris produces the perfect king, Horus. Further, as attested by tomb inscriptions, both women and men could syncretize, identify, with Osiris at their death, another set of evidence that underlines Osiris's androgynous nature. Death or transition and institution as god of the afterlife. Plutarch and others have noted that the sacrifices to Osiris were gloomy, solemn, and mournful, and that the great mystery festival, celebrated in 2 phases, began at Abydos, commemorating the death of the god, on the same day that grain was planted in the ground. The annual festival involved the construction of Osiris beds formed in shape of Osiris, filled with soil and sown with seed. The germinating seed symbolized Osiris rising from the dead. An almost pristine example was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The Imiyat emblem, an image of a stuffed, headless skin of an animal tied to a pole mounting a pot, was a symbol associated both with Osiris as god of the underworld and with Anubis, god of mummification, was sometimes included among a deceased person's funerary equipment. The first phase of the festival was a public drama depicting the murder and dismemberment of Osiris, the search for his body by Isis, his triumphal return as the resurrected god, and the battle in which Horus defeated Set. According to Julius Firmicus Maternus of the 4th century, this play was reenacted each year by worshippers who beat their breasts and gashed their shoulders. When they pretend that the mutilated remains of the god have been found and rejoined, they turn from mourning to rejoicing. De errore profanarum religionum. The passion of Osiris was reflected in his name Wennenefer, the one who continues to be perfect, which also alludes to his post-mortem power. Ichernofret Stela. Much of the extant information about the rites of Osiris can be found on the Ichernofret Stela at Abydos, erected in the 12th dynasty by Ichernofret, possibly a priest of Osiris or other official. The titles of Ichernofret are described in his stela from Abydos. During the reign of Senwosret III, Pharaoh Sesostris, about 1875 BC. The ritual reenactment of Osiris's funeral rites were held in the last month of the inundation, the annual Nile flood, coinciding with spring, and held at Abydos, which was the traditional place where the body of Osiris drifted ashore after having been drowned in the Nile. The part of the myth recounting the chopping up of the body into 14 pieces by Set is not recounted in this particular stela, although it is attested to be a part of the rituals by a version of the papyrus Jimmelhak, in which it took Isis 12 days to reassemble the pieces, coinciding with the festival of plowing. Some elements of the ceremony were held in the temple, while others involved public participation in a form of theater. The stela of Ichernofret recounts the program of events of the public elements over the 5 days of the festival. The first day, the procession of Wepwawet. A mock battle was enacted during which the enemies of Osiris are defeated. A procession was led by the god Wepwawet, opener of the way. The second day, the great procession of Osiris. The body of Osiris was taken from his temple to his tomb. The boat he was transported in, the Neshmet bark, had to be defended against his enemies. The third day, Osiris is mourned and the enemies of the land are destroyed. The fourth day, night vigil, prayers and recitations are made and funeral rites performed. The fifth day, Osiris is reborn. Osiris is reborn at dawn and crowned with the crown of Ma'at. The statue of Osiris is brought back to the temple. Wheat and clay rituals. Contrasting with the public theatrical ceremonies sourced from the Middle Kingdom Ichernofret stele, More esoteric ceremonies were performed inside the temples by priests. Plutarch mentions that, for much later period, 2 days after the beginning of the festival, the priests bring forth a sacred chest containing a small golden coffer into which they pour some potable water, and a great shout arises from the company for joy that Osiris is found, or resurrected. Then they knead some fertile soil with the water, and fashion therefrom a crescent-shaped figure, which they cloth and adorn, this indicating that they regard these gods as the substance of earth and water. Yet his accounts were still obscure, for he also wrote, "I pass over the cutting of the wood," opting not to describe it, since he considered it as a most sacred ritual, Abid 21. In the Assyrian temple at Dendera, an inscription, translated by Budge, chapter 15, Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection, describes in detail the making of wheat paste models of each dismembered piece of Osiris to be sent out to the town where each piece is discovered by Isis. At the temple of Mendes, figures of Osiris were made from wheat and paste placed in a trough on the day of the murder. Then water was added for several days, until finally the mixture was kneaded into a mold of Osiris and taken to the temple to be buried. The sacred grain for these cakes were grown only in the temple fields. Molds were made from the wood of a red tree in the forms of the 16 dismembered parts of Osiris. The cakes of divine bread were made from each mold, placed in a silver chest, and set near the head of the god with the inward parts of Osiris, as described in the Book of the Dead. Judgment. The idea of divine justice being exercised after death for wrongdoing during life is first encountered during the Old Kingdom in a 6th dynasty tomb containing fragments of what would be described later as the negative confessions performed in front of the 42 assessors of Mahat. At death, a person faced judgment by a tribunal of 42 divine judges. If they led a life in conformance with the precepts of the goddess Ma'at, who represented truth and right living, the person was welcomed into the kingdom of Osiris. If found guilty, the person was thrown to the soul-eating demon Ammit and did not share in eternal life. The person who is taken by the devourer is subject first to terrifying punishment and then annihilated. These depictions of punishment may have influenced medieval perceptions of the inferno in hell via early Christian and Coptic texts. Purification for those who are considered justified may be found in the descriptions of Flame Island, where they experience the triumph over evil and rebirth. For the damned, complete destruction into a state of non-being awaits, but there is no suggestion of eternal torture. During the reign of Seti I, Osiris was also invoked in royal decrees to pursue the living when wrongdoing was observed but kept secret and not reported. Greco-Roman era. Hellenization. The early Ptolemaic kings promoted a new god, Serapis, who combined traits of Osiris with those of various Greek gods and was portrayed in a Hellenistic form. Serapis was often treated as the consort of Isis and became the patron deity of the Ptolemies' capital, Alexandria. Serapis's origins are not known. Some ancient authors claim the cult of Serapis was established at Alexandria by Alexander the Great himself, but most who discuss the subject of Serapis's origins give a story similar to that by Plutarch. Writing about 400 years after the fact, Plutarch claimed that Ptolemy I established the cult after dreaming of a colossal statue at Sinope in Anatolia. His counselors identified the statue as the Greek god Pluto and said that the Egyptian name for Pluto was Serapis. This name may have been a Hellenization of Osiris Apis. Osiris Apis was a patron deity of the Memphite necropolis and the father of the Apis bull who was worshipped there, and texts from Ptolemaic times treat Serapis as the Greek translation of Osiris Apis. But little of the early evidence for Serapis's cult comes from Memphis, and much of it comes from the Mediterranean world, with no reference to an Egyptian origin for Serapis. So Mark Smith expresses doubt that Serapis originated as a Greek form of Osiris Apis's name, and leaves open the possibility that Serapis originated outside Egypt. Destruction of cult. The cult of Isis and Osiris continued at Philae until at least the 450 SCE, long after the imperial decrees of the late 4th century that ordered the closing of temples to pagan gods. Philae was the last major ancient Egyptian temple to be closed,